Jag välkomnar till Noaks Ark-podden här. Jag heter Jukka Aminoff och arbetar på Riksförbundet Noaks Ark. Och jag är på AIDS Impact-konferensen i London, en konferens som sedan många år tillbaka försöker följa HIV-AIDS-problematiken ur ett helhetsperspektiv, alltså inte bara biomedicinskt utan också psykosocialt. Med har jag här Ward van Bilsen. Han är doktorand vid universitetet i Amsterdam. Och också sedan 2 år tillbaka engagerad vid Public Health Service of Amsterdam, där det finns en kohortstudie som har pågått sedan 1984, så han har massor med information. Welcome, Ward.
Thank you.
You had a very interesting presentation the other day here that was concerning the psychosocial well-being of people living with HIV in this area when we have this fantastic medication. And some people are saying it's no big deal any longer, and why should we talk about HIV? And you have interviewed a lot of people. I'm very curious about, could you tell us about your findings?
Yes, of course. Well, this study came along because we also find it very interesting that there are a lot of developments now going on in the medical field. So they have new ART regimens, there is PrEP, we have the USU campaigns. So we were wondering, well, what is still perceived as a burden of living with HIV among men who have sex with men? So that's what we try to study. And what we actually found is that these developments actually changed the burden. So most participants we interviewed, so we conducted interviews, and most participants told us that they really perceived that the burden was lower. Now these new developments have been around, but still we found some other burdensome aspects. They also mentioned some things that they struggled with, the most remarkable thing was for me actually also that there are 2 kinds of burden. So the first type of burden that was mentioned was actually a burden that emerged really soon after their diagnosis. And it mostly related to the shock that they had when becoming diagnosed. So they had a lot of emotions with being shocked, feeling angry, guilty, ashamed. There was a lot of uncertainty about the future. So those were things that were mostly going on shortly after diagnosis. And then they became in this trajectory of going to the hospital to take medication, and so their life was actually medicalized. So they also struggled in the beginning a lot with that, to put this ART taking into their daily routine, to undergo these medical investigations for the first time, which were also for some very stressful. So they also really struggled with that, and they also struggled a little bit with, in the beginning, to adapt to this HIV identity, to actually accept being HIV positive. And it was in the beginning for most a little bit difficult because of this self-stigma, because of this feeling of shame, guilt, and stuff like that. But actually these things were things that actually improved over time. So when people were like a year later after their diagnosis, these things actually were not that burdensome anymore for most participants. And the thing that was mentioned a year after diagnosis were mostly related to troubles with disclosing, stigma, and social and sexual experiences. And for most, the most burdensome aspect was disclosure, because they had a continuous dilemma of disclosing or not disclosing. Because if they thought about disclosing, they thought about fear for people who would stigmatize them, who would reject them. But if they did not disclose, then they felt that they would withhold information, and they would struggle with that, and they felt being dishonest. And this dilemma actually also resulted for most in difficulty to initiate sex or to engage in more serious relationships. So that was for most people a really big struggle, actually.
With disclosure, we mean telling about one's HIV infection to other people, just in case we have switched public. So
Sure. Yeah. Telling about their HIV status to
Yes.
others. Definitely. So, and that was something that was really interesting, because that was somehow affected by, for example, PrEP, because participants told us that they felt it was easier now to disclose their HIV status to others, because they were not infectious anymore, so they didn't fear of infecting other people, and because other people were on PrEP, so other people weren't that much interested in the HIV status of their partners. So that was something also that changed. So, but still, it was mentioned as something that was burdensome.
PrEP means that there's been a lot of discussions here, as PrEP is taking HIV drugs in order to protect oneself against a future infection. Did many use PrEP, and how the person who is HIV positive, how does that help the person who already has HIV?
Because they find it easier to have sex or to be with someone who is HIV negative and on PrEP.
Yes.
Because then they feel...
You ask, are you using PrEP?
Yeah, so they experience it in a way that the other person doesn't really care about their HIV status, because they are already protected. So I think that they feel that HIV negative people have less fear of becoming infected.
Is it easy to get PrEP in Amsterdam?
Not that easy. PrEP has been around since 2015, but mainly in a study context, so in research setting. And actually, since the beginning of 2018, the price dropped for PrEP. So it was around 360 euro, and now it's I think like 30 euros for 30 tablets. So we see now that the uptake is increasing, and this summer the national government will start providing PrEP also. So it is becoming more available. So we see the uptake increasing, but it goes not that fast as we would like it to go.
Some people perhaps buy through the internet themselves.
Yes, they do. Yeah. So that was mainly something that was done a few years ago. Now the prices are lower. I see a lot of men who now get it via their GP or at the STI clinic. So it's becoming more available. And I also think that the willingness to take PrEP is also increasing now.
During your presentation here, you mentioned that disclosure of one's HIV status was correlated to positive effects in the well-being of the people. Could you tell us a little bit about
definitely.
that?
Yeah, I think it's also very important to mention that there were also some positive aspects of living with HIV. With regard to disclosure, we also heard that some people really struggled with the dilemma on disclosing or not disclosing, but once they told, for example, family or friends, they felt a relief, because like I mentioned in the beginning, they had some struggle with this self-stigma and getting used to being HIV positive. And they also experienced that once they told family or friends, then they could get support. So they felt supported, and most didn't experience any negative reactions. So for most, it was something that they mentioned as really positive, that they now had a closer bond with family and friends. And other positive things that were mentioned, and I think that's also good to mention, is that in the beginning, for example, people felt really vulnerable and mortal, but on the long term, they also became more grateful in life, grateful to be alive, grateful to have this medication, and that they could prioritize aspects in their life more. So they lived more conscious, actually. So that's also something that was really mentioned as a positive aspect of living with HIV.
But the stigma still prevails, even in a group of men who have sex with men, MSM, who, after all these years of information and education.
Yeah, and that was something that was mainly mentioned when disclosing to sex partners or potential new partners, because then there was more fear of getting infected. So that was a whole different experience for them if they disclosed, compared to when they disclosed to family or friends. That was a whole different thing, actually. So the stigma was mainly among their partners, sex partners, online.
But most of how did the people in the study describe those who had disclosed to their families and friends? There were no negative reactions.
No,
it was giving them
very supportive,
strength.
actually. Yes. And for sex partners, it was also mentioned that some sex partners didn't care. They were totally okay with it, but for some they got rejected, and it was a negative experience.
So fear of rejection is still a reality.
Yeah, and the question is we talk a lot about stigma also on this conference, and I think it's really a big thing, and I think it's something that also happens, but I think we have to distinguish stigma that actually occurs, so that is when people actually have a negative reaction on HIV positive people, but the other thing is that there is also a lot of fear for stigma, which doesn't necessarily mean that there will be stigma, but there is this internalized fear of being stigmatized, and that's something totally different, because I spoke to a lot of participants and clients at the STI clinic who actually had a lot of fear, but once I asked them, okay, but what are your experiences? It was not that negative, actually. They also had a lot of positive experiences, but still they had this fear of being stigmatized. So it's really rooted into their beliefs and perceptions, actually.
Perhaps that will change in time when people in general will understand that undetectable virus is untransmittable.
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so. I hope that USU and PrEP will lower the stigma, and that HIV positive people will less fear stigma.
You've been active at the Amsterdam Cohort Studies, and during the years since 1984, the group included in the cohort has been expanding. I'm curious about how do young people included in the cohort today? How are young people relating to HIV-related issues?
That's a good question. So I work for the Amsterdam Cohort Studies, and that consists of 750 HIV-negative MSM and also around 70 HIV-positive MSM. So I do these study visits and I speak to these men. And it consists of old gay men, but also some younger gay men, so it's very diverse. And I see a lot of difference between these two groups, actually. Because when I talk to somewhat older MSM who experienced HIV and AIDS in the more early years, they have seen people dying from AIDS. And they have still this image of, okay, HIV is something I definitely should avoid getting. They are afraid of it, and they because of this fear, actually are more likely and willing to prevent themselves, to use prevention tools to prevent them from getting HIV infected. It's not the case for everybody, of course, but to generalize it a little bit. But I also see some younger MSM, and when I speak to them, some of them also have this fear of becoming infected, and they really don't want it, and they also they use these prevention tools. But I also speak to some young gay men who actually say, well, okay, how bad is HIV? Because it's treatable. You can take just a pill once a day. I know some people who have it. They just like me, and I don't really care that much. So to use a condom, well, okay, I try to do it, but if I fail to use a condom, well, for me it's not that bad, you know. So that's a whole different way of perceiving HIV. And that's actually what we also want to study, because now we did these interviews with gay men who live with HIV, and we want to see now how do especially young MSM, but MSM in general, perceive the burden of HIV. So HIV negative MSM, how do they perceive the burden of HIV? So do they misperceive it? Do they even underestimate the burden? Because that might have some consequences for the uptake of a lot of prevention programs we have in the Netherlands. If they underestimate it a lot, then they are also, I think, less willing to use PrEP or use condoms or do other things to avoid getting infected. So I think that's something that we really need to study and to focus on in recent years. Because we have these beautiful programs and we have these beautiful tools like PrEP, but if nobody is willing to take it, then we have a problem actually.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you too.
Thank you.